Hello, Mayor Pro Tem, members of council. Adam Smith, project manager in the city manager's office, with a presentation on a resolution opposing the Taxpayer Protection and Government Accountability Act. The recommendation is that the city council adopt a resolution opposing the act, which is known as initiative number 21004-2A1, Taxpayer Protection and Government Accountability Act, which will appear on the November 5th, 2024 ballot. A little bit of background on the act. It's a statewide initiative measure to amend the state's constitution, which will appear next year in November. The act ultimately limits voter authority and input, adopts new stricter rules for raising taxes and fees, and may make it more difficult for impacted governments to impose fines and penalties for violation of state and local laws. Basically, the act limits the ability of voters and governments to raise revenue for governmental operations that provide services to their communities. So the act creates several effects on local governments and local voters, which includes prohibiting local advisory measures, which ask voters to advise a town, a city like Oxnard, or a county on how to spend revenue. It sets a new standard for fees and charges paid for local and state government property use. This is commonly referred to as franchise fees, which are imposed by local governments on companies and utilities that conduct business in the municipality for use of the municipality's infrastructure for their daily business operations. The act will also may make it harder for governments to charge fees for services. It requires voter approval to expand existing taxes into new annexed areas, and new taxes can only be imposed for a specific time period. In other words, a sunset period for all new taxes after the act's passage, if it were to pass. It's important to note that the act is sponsored by the California Business Roundtable, CBR, which is a collection of some of the state's largest corporations, including ExxonMobil, Chevron, Valero, Wells Fargo. A full listing of the CBR's board is attached to the staff report. So in the current fee and tax structure in California, in many cases, the most significant source of local government revenue is the property tax. Other local taxes, of course, include sales tax, utility tax, and transient occupancy tax, which is a hotel tax. State law requires that increases in local taxes needs to receive approval from the local governing body, like the city council and voters. And most proposed taxes are general taxes that require a simple majority vote of the electorate. Special taxes, which are those used for a specific purpose, need a 2/3 super majority vote of the electorate. Local governments like the city also levy various fees and additional charges for the services that the city provides. You can think of this like recreation services, ball field rentals, things like that. The fees cannot exceed the reasonable cost to the local government of providing that product or service. And then the city uses revenue from these taxes and fees to fund a variety of services in the community, like fire and police, public works, and parks. Also importantly, local government tax revenue raising authority is already restricted by state statute and constitutional provisions, including Prop 13, which was a restriction on property tax in the state, Proposition 218, which limits the government's authority and methods to raise revenue without taxpayer consent, and Proposition 26, which reclassified some fees that the state levied as taxes with a majority vote approval, shifting that to a 2/3 vote approval. And the act expands these restrictions by prohibiting local advisory measures, citizen initiative tax measures, where citizens in the community would gather support to place an initiative on the ballot to raise tax. It currently needs only a majority of voters' approval. The act expands that to the 2/3 supermajority level. And then a sunset provision on all tax measures. All tax measures need a end date, and importantly, the Act also cancels measures that have already passed in 2022. There were, in 2022, there were 17 local special taxes placed on the ballot by citizen initiative, which only required a majority vote. And then statewide, there were literally hundreds of tax measures that passed by voters that will now need to be reintroduced to be effective, or they will cancel out after 1 year from the approval of the act. So virtually every city, county, and special district in California already regularly adopts increases to fee rates and charges and revises rate schedules to accommodate new users and activities as well as inflation. Most of these would now be subject to new standards and limitations under threat of legal challenges. As reported previously, in many cases, the existing fee structure, especially in the city, already reflect actual costs. If the city council wished to impose a new fee or make changes to an existing fee, the act generally would require that the charge be both reasonable and reflect the minimum amount necessary to city operations and provide the service. This is extremely ambiguous because the term reasonable is not defined. So there's still more to sort out as we get closer to the vote in November 2024. If a fee payer challenges the charge or fee, state and local governments now will bear the burden of providing clear and convincing evidence that the levy is a fee, which is not subject to a vote and is not a tax. On the measure, or on the issue of locally approved taxes, hundreds of local tax measures were approved by voters in 2022, which was mentioned previously. Revenues from these voter-approved measures will cease a year after the act's effective date, which will reduce the local public services that are currently funded by these new measures unless the already approved tax is resubmitted for voter approval. That's problematic because if the act passed in 2024, voiding these taxes in 2022, the local government needs to set up a special election to put that local tax back on the ballot, which is costly. And so there's a lot of uncertainty around that as well. Reductions in local government tax revenues can impact core services and infrastructure. And the table on this next slide is, I'm going to show you some examples of recently passed voter-approved tax measures that at the local level that would now be subject to the act's provisions, mainly because they do not have a sunset date. So you see examples from Mendocino County, LA County, the city of Alameda, the city of Culver City, brand new measures that passed in 2022 that provide anywhere from $900,000 per year in revenue to $15 million will all now need to go before voters within 1 year of the act's passage, or they will be void. By altering how taxes are brought before voters and restricting these changes to fees, the act would make it more challenging for local governments to raise revenue, raising the specter of city services and residents being impacted. Revenue that local governments receive from fees and local taxes are put right back into the community for services and programs that will likely be impacted. And local tax and fee revenue would be lower than they would be otherwise. Just as a quick example for possible examples of city affected fees and charges, we have building plan check and inspection from Community Development Department, franchise fees, playfield rentals, and the Del Norte refuse tip fee all could be impacted should the act pass. On the financial impact, there's no financial impact to adopting a resolution opposing the act. However, the passage of the act may adversely affect the city's ability to generate certain revenue in the future. State Attorney General Rob Bonta wrote in a summary of the fiscal effect that government should expect lower annual revenue, potentially substantially lower. So ending where we began with the recommendation that City Council adopt a resolution opposing the initiative known as the Taxpayer Protection and Government Accountability Act, which will appear on the November 5th, 2024 ballot. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.